When was the first time that you came across this idea of dark retreat? Where were you? How did you stumble across this teaching that's fairly little known actually? So that's why I asked that question. You, of course, you can be well and truly practicing in the tradition like of Karma Kagyu or Tibetan Buddhism and never really come across this. And so, I know you were steeped in the tradition, and I was wondering, where was the first place that you encountered and heard about these teachings?
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. In thinking back, um, the first kind of iteration of kind of understanding that there was even a practice of dark retreat um, occurred in relationship to one of my teachers who used to live in Sikkim, the late Pathing Rinpoche,
Mm.
who was a very, very remarkable Lama. He had come down from Tibet actually in the 1930s before the Chinese had invaded and kind of missed all of the chaos of that and lived as a kind of, yogi village, Rinpoche doing, a lot of kind of, maybe you could say like village-based pastoral care work in addition to his own retreat tent. And when I was doing, let's see, in 97, I had the opportunity to do some retreat with him in his retreat place in this very remote part of Sikkim on the border of Bhutan. And he was taking me around the retreat property. And there's really kind of traditional Sikkimese buildings where it's like stone on the bottom where you store things, a big open kind of almost like uh, grotto kind of thing, and then this small wooden structure on top. And inside was a wooden box. And I asked him, Rinpoche, what's this? And he was like, oh, this is where my body should be placed when I die, so I can dissolve into a rainbow.
Wow.
And so, I'd heard, again, like in the Kaji tradition, maybe, one might hear a little bit about this kind of stuff, but it's really more kind of like a Nyingma based, um, phenomenon, maybe you could say. And so this got me curious, but as you point out, there's really precious little you can look for. So I think here and there, maybe like one sentence in one book, one
Mm.
footnote in another book, and this kind of stuff. Um, However, Pathing Rinpoche was a direct student of Ani Dechen, who was one of the great masters of the Yangti tradition. She died in the 1950s, and he had studied with her in Tibet before he came down to Sikkim. He was very, very devoted to her. So slowly I learned, a tiny, tiny, tiny little bit. And it was he who gave me this text that was just all dark retreat visions. He gave this to me in the early aughts, maybe like 2002, 2003, and didn't explain much except that he would teach it. I would have to be there for a long time. And I had a young child at the time. So it wasn't until later, 2015, that I was able to connect with the teacher, Dr. Nida Chenagtsang. And I handed him the text, and he was like, "Oh, I know what this is. This is a dark retreat, text."
Mm.
And my root teacher was a Sikkimese nun who was kind of rather bold in the way she was. I guess maybe you have to be as an ordained woman, to kind of have an equal footing, so to speak. She kind of trained me to be bold too. So I immediately asked him, "Oh, will you teach this to me?" And he said, "Well, not yet, but yes." And um, during COVID is when I started to practice dark retreat, kind of in earnest. Um,
Mm.
yeah,
So rich there. I want to go back to Pathing Rinpoche.
please.
Pathing
Yeah, yeah,
Rinpoche, was it? Yeah. And
yeah.
so you were in the border of Sikkim and Bhutan, and
Mhm.
um, he was an older Lama when you were with him. Is that right?
Yeah, in his 90s
No, in
when I
his
first met.
90s. Wow. So
Yeah.
when he says this is where my body should be
Oh
kept,
yeah.
yeah, he's not talking about like in like 50 years time.
No, no, no.
Wow.
Yeah, and
And
it was interesting because my root teacher was quite sick at the time, and I had met her in '95, and then came back to uh, visit with her in '97, and ended up staying a year at her request. But she died during that trip. Pathing Rinpoche and I both showed up at her doorstep at exactly the same time. He had come to
wow.
do some Singamuka puja for her, and I had showed up like some freshly graduated, you know, former college student. Um, and, she took note of this, like, oh, this is very interesting. Like both of you kind of showing
Tendro.
up. Exactly. Yeah.
Did you mention her name, your root teacher?
Yeah. Ani Dechen Zangmo.
Ani Dechen Zangmo. Okay,
Yeah.
wonderful. So so you met her first, and then through her you met Pathing Rinpoche.
That's right. That's
And
right.
then you were with Pathing Rinpoche, this early Lama, and and you're going to do a retreat with him. And what was that retreat?
So
Um,
the retreat was the prostrations part of the Karmakaju Nunjo.
uh,
So I spent time, I mean, very, very, very rustic kind of cabin. No panes of glass in the windows, just kind of like open air. No heat. No prostrations with no pads.
yes.
And he had installed a buzzer in the room, and he would wake me up at 2:30 in the morning, and he would just hear zzz, 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 zzz,
Wow.
and I have to get up and
So
start then.
so you were doing the retreat, and he was guiding you and helping you. Was that the situation?
Yeah, and then he spent as much time in his own retreat as he could.
Uh-huh.
He was an interesting person because, and I kind of credit him with being a kind of, I guess, a symbolic referent that got me interested in chaplaincy. Because when he wasn't in retreat, he would literally travel from home to home to home wherever people needed his support for pujas or poa or spiritual emotional support, regardless of anybody's economic background. He would stay with the Chogyal. He would stay with the
Oh,
forest
wow.
people in Gangtok. Yeah, so he was very well known for this. In fact, there had been one random point where I was in Lal Bazaar, the main bazaar in Gangtok,
Yeah.
and someone came up to me, a random person, and said, "Oh, I know who you are." And I was like, "Oh, who? How?" And he was
Who
like, "Oh,
am
you're
I?
this, you're the tall like Inji student of Pathing Rinpoche." And I was like, "Yes." And he was like, "Oh, he's a very powerful sorcerer, isn't he?" So he had this reputation for
Was he a
in
monk
that
or a Ngakpa or what?
he was you know
What did he wear? Like monk's robes
like
or?
he wore monk's robes. He mostly wore yellow. It
Yeah.
was kind of interesting. um and he may have done Nakba practice as well. It's a little hard to tell. He did tell me at one point, he's like, I hold all of the major lineages,
Yeah.
and I do believe that. And
Who was his guru? Sorry, root guru. Was that
Ani
clear?
Shuk Ani Shukseb.
Ah, okay, yeah. So
Yeah,
Anishukseb. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So um, yeah, so he was really of that generation. It was also interesting because he had two very tiny monasteries, which were inhabited by like monks age 5 to 11. Very kind of like wild places. So you see in rural Sikkim. Um, so as far as the monasticism goes, like you've been to Sikkim, I know, and
Yeah.
so there's this term like basti for village, right?
Yeah.
So through him, I met a lot of the basti lamas or the village lamas who were farmer like Marpa farmers during the day,
Yeah.
and then they would do take time for retreat for a year at a time when they could, and things like this. So it's a really nice thing to be exposed to, rather than, and I don't have any issue with this at all, but the kind of high classical monasticism that you find might
Mm.
that gets a little preferred or focused on maybe here in the West.
Mm. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's interesting this in Sikkim, this mixing of all the different types of ways of practicing Dharma, and even shamanism and all this sort of stuff. Like
Yes.
my teacher, I have a place at his monastery, and below our place was the local shaman. So,
Hmm.
and he's not Buddhist. He's
Hmm.
connected to the
Right.
monastery helping, but he was a shaman, and so we'd be at like 2 a.m. in the morning, we'd hear the drums still going and dancing and chanting and whatever they were doing down there. They were just a little bit down. Like it's like, oh
Yeah.
wow, there's something pretty powerful going on down there. And that was like, we were like on monastery grounds, and they were just below it. It's so mixed and so
Yes.
interesting. And
Yeah.
he would you support the monastery as well in certain ways. So yeah, it's cool this sort of mixing of different Sikhs are actually, the hidden land, the secret land is very, very special. So this is
Yeah.
a great setting for this. And this Lama is talking about rainbow body, and he's handing you this text. And can you describe a little bit the imagery on the text for our?
Yeah. So the first page is, everything is written in Ume, the kind of longhand script. So the title page is just, the text, and then there's a successive, I think it's about 5 or 6 kind of frames of successive visualizations. It starts off with the yogic postures, and then different visions that occur within the context of this practice of uh, Yangti, or dark retreat, which is really the practice of Togal, in the dark. And it moves, it was really fascinating. I used to stare at it for long periods of time, trying to kind of understand what is this, right?
Yeah.
And at one point, the images look almost like Buddhas emerging from space,
Yes.
and it wasn't until getting into the practice of Yangti that all of a sudden all of this made real palpable
Made
sense.
sense. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so he gave that text for you, right?
yes.
You kept that text.
So
Interesting.
he didn't give it to us. He let us take a photo of
Oh,
each
okay,
page.
cool.
He was like, "This is mine,"
Yes,
but
yeah, this is
you
precious.
should, yeah, but you should have this,
Have a
so
copy.
have a
Okay.
copy. So given the highly secretive nature and kind of just restrictive nature, it was with Pathing Rinpoche my whole life, up until I started doing Yangti practice. I really had a hard time understanding the nature of my relationship to him, because it just didn't make any sense.
Yes.
Here, I was at the time like a young Western man, meeting this, really somebody of the generation of previous Doga Kensei or Tuku
Yeah.
Urgen, or these great masters, who spent, he told me, he spent about 40 years in retreat, all kind of combined. So somebody who has also this kind of basis of practice, um, I could not relate to, other than kind of in a little bit of a like mythic uh, kind of narrative way. But now, over time, getting to do the practice of Yangti, I'm kind of realizing that my relationship with him was more central than I could have possibly even understood, even with the language difference and all of this kind of thing. He was exceedingly kind, exceedingly generous.
He opened the door for you to this practice in a way. And
Exactly.
and and probably knew that he was doing that, even though he might have known that he might not be the one to actually guide you through it. He'd sort of set you on that path. And just this imagery, and maybe the list, like, can I ask this? So, is the imagery
Hmm.
that you were looking at? It's like people might be familiar of the Lukang, the fifth Dalai
Hmm.
Lama's secret
Hmm.
temple, and the postures
Yes.
and some imagery. Is this the type of thing where more simplified versions of that? Is that what we're sort of talking about here, or is it different?
Yeah, it's similar, very similar in certain ways. There are particular parallels in terms of some of the imagery, and then yeah, I mean, you could say yes, because the Lukang is really focusing on Togal with light
Yeah,
instructions, the kind of
yeah,
visionary experience that happens with this. In the dark, it's kind of more the case that these visions or the visionary phenomena happen in a very, very kind of intensive and
Mm,
quick way. But yes, things like peacock feathers and
mm.
like the Vajra chains and things like this that are a
Yes.
little bit more common to Togal. There's things like this, and then yeah, if you really, I mean, it's a shame the Reuben, is closed because this is a really good room to go in
Oh, that
for
was
the
excellent, that room. Yeah.
yeah, and to really, I spent time there quite a bit because I used to offer these dark retreat workshops there, and it
Mm,
would start with a tour of the Lukang mural room so that people could kind of get a sense of like the context, there's more kind of a yogic practice, and then B, um, the visionary quality of it, which is fascinating because it's very different from what we might call like the classical monastic Buddhism or Dharma that tends to be focused on in kind of the more public arena, right? Which meditation, ethics, mind training, all these things which are good and very, very important, deity yoga as well. With the practice of Dzogchen, you're really trying to get out of your own way and kind of embrace an effortlessness in letting things happen rather than making things happen.
so that was well said. And then so you're sitting with this text for many years, right?
Yeah,
You have it and you're it seems like you're looking at it every now and again, and it's not until you meet with Dr. Nida, yeah, and
yeah, yeah,
you show him and he says, I know exactly what this is.
yeah,
And he says
exactly.
this has to do with this thing called dark retreat, right?
Yes, yeah, exactly. And so he suggested that he had just published a commentary on the Dzogchen instructions uh, connected with Gyuto Gyomten Gompo, who was the founder of the Tibetan medical tradition and a great
Mm.
kind of Ngakpa style yogin. Um, and so he suggested I come out to Portland where he was giving teachings on this. So I did, and he said, you should study and practice this for a while, and then when you're ready, we can move into dark retreat. Myself not understanding that there is a practice of dark retreat within the Utognintic as well,
Mm.
um, which is what I entered into dark retreat through. So I started with that practice, and then which is a little different, I guess you could say, from the Yangti Nakpo based instructions,
Okay.
which I then received from him from his dark retreat teacher in Tibet.
Okay, fantastic. So, Dr. Nida, tell us, maybe we should spend a little bit of time just describing him because often, like you hear this, he's a doctor, obviously, Dr. Nida,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
but not all doctors are lamas and
Exactly.
teachers. So, tell us a little bit about his background and how he got connected with Dark Retreat. Then, I guess.
Yeah, so he is a Ngakpa from Amdo in Tibet, coming from the Rebkang Ngakpa tradition. And he wasn't like born into that like through family practice necessarily, but came into this as a very young adult when he was telling me that when it was time for him to, yeah, his parents were like, what are you going to do with your life, he was very connected to nature and plants and animals and things like this. So he thought that starting off with Tibetan medicine would be a good place to start, and then from there, the practice of Dharma came kind of naturally, and he started connecting with more of these Ngakpa based practices. So the Utognintic, which it's not necessarily inherently Ngakpa based, but it's a
Mm.
spiritual system that is practiced by many Tibetan doctors, many of whom tend to be lay practitioners. So there's a whole path, Nundro, creation stage practices, completion stage practices, Mahamudra, Hatha Yoga, and then this practice of dark retreat as well. So he trained in this, and then aspects of the Dijum Tersar and Wanchen Dik and And then, of course, his dark retreat teacher, Karjik Korlo Rinpoche, was basically a specialist in this practice. So he trained under him as well.
So he was he trained in Tibetan medicine, and then he because he's in Tibetan medicine, he was attracted to the Yutok Nyingtik, which is
Mhm,
related to medicine, but is also,
mhm.
the Dzogchen cycle, pre-long Chempa, right? Nyingtik,
Exactly,
yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
And so he goes to
And th-
Rebkong to learn this. Is that what he does?
yeah, well, he's from that area
Oh, he's
of
from
Tibet.
Rebkong.
He's
Okay,
from
yeah.
Repkong, yeah. And so there was this, and then he
And who is
uh
his teacher in that lineage? Who is his teacher?
so his teacher, I can't remember the name right now, but
Okay.
his one of his teachers was Ani Gyaltsen, who was the heart daughter of Ani Shuksep. So
Okay.
through through her, he had received this kind of line of instruction also that came from Ani Shuksep too.
In the
So
Yuntuk Nyingtik, the Yuntuk Nyingtik.
in no separately. So for
Okay.
example, the teachings from Shabkar and all of
Yeah.
these things. Ani Shuksab had received from one of Shabkar's students. So
Wow.
Ani Shuksab had received that and then passed it on to Ani Gyaltsen. And Ani Gyaltsen, at the time when he was in Lhasa training at the Mensi Kang, was elderly. And he, at some point during COVID, was talking about how his classmates used to make fun of him for on his breaks. Momensi Khan going to study with this old woman. Like, what are you doing? Studying with her. She was, just they're like, you should study with these great men. And he was kind of like, well, this is she's realized her Dharma lineage is pure and all this kind of thing. So there's that connection too. And when I first showed him the Dark Retreat text, he asked
Yeah.
me, the first thing was like, where did you get this? And I told him about Pathing Rinpoche. And he was like, who was his teacher? And I said, Ani Shuksab. And he was like, oh,
Okay.
we're kind of a little related in this way.
They're connected because
Yeah,
his this Ani that he was studying with studied with her, so that came full circle, that cycle. Okay, so then that
exactly.
was a great connection then. And so then
Yeah.
when you say Mensa you mean in Tibet, Lhasa, is it?
In Lhasa, that's
Yeah,
correct. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
so okay, so Dr. Nida's there, and you're like, so you probably want to practice this, right? You want to, and
Yeah,
so
yeah.
he's saying, but then he said, okay, before you go into that particular uh practice, let's do this other dark retreat practice. Is that how that went?
No, he said let's do the Ati Yoga cycle associated with the Yutuk Nintik. So the whole kind of arc of Guru Yoga, training body, speech, and mind, Rushen,
Okay. And then how did
Trekche.
he what's his lineage of here like that? Where did that come from? This one that he first introduced you to. Is that
Oh, this one. So it's based on a set of instructions that comes through the Yutuk Nintik
yeah.
on Ati Yoga specifically. The complete
Oh,
liberation of samsara and
yeah.
nirvana is the name of
Okay.
that text. And like you point out, it's this early Nintik, so predating Longchenpa by a couple of centuries, or about a century. And actually, it's a very interesting text in the sense that it's kind of a little bit more of a bridge in terms of Tantra and Ati Yoga together.
Yeah.
It's got like a nice flavor to it that's a little different than you see how Dzogchen has developed over time. The dark retreat associated with the Yutok Nintik is actually associated with the practice of Tumo.
Oh,
Um,
really?
yeah, and what's interesting is so I under one of my lamas, so concurrent to studying with Pathing Rinpoche, I studied with the previous Boku Rinpoche until
Yes.
he passed, and then when he passed, I became a formal student of His Eminence Gyaltsab Rinpoche,
Yes.
and through him, I trained in the six yogas. And there's this part of the illusory body instruction for the six yogas that talks about mentions like firefly light, all these different visionary phenomena, right? Um, Firefly light, butter lamp
Yeah.
flickering light, all of this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And what? when I was doing illusory body, that part of the practice, I understood conceptually, but had not had experience of. Then when I got into the 7-day Yutuk Nintik based dark retreat, all of those things occurred. The firefly light, the butter lamp light, all those kinds of things. And I remember them so clearly from the illusory body text that I was like in the dark, in this small room, like very, very excited to have actually had this experience, which was is very, very kind of important, a way for me to kind of gain confirmation that actually there's something much, much different about this kind of practice.
This is very interesting. It makes sense you say that it's related with the tumo because those are normally signs of dissolutions you're
Exactly.
talking about, which
Hmm.
in a dark retreat, we'll talk more about it, but that seems like normally a dark retreat, you might not think that it's associated with dissolution practices of the subtle energies. So in this particular
Exactly.
dark retreat, what's the relationship between in this practice the dark retreat and the tumo practice to bring about the dissolution to see the visions? Is the dark retreat a support for the visions, or what's the relationship here?
Yes. Yeah. So one trains in Tumo and then does this dark retreat
Yeah.
after. And then this is when those experiences of the dissolutions occur. In the more Yangti Nakpo based dark retreat practice, one of the things that ends up um, occurring at one point is the same thing, these dissolutions of consciousness and this experience of the five colored lights as the kind of arisal of the pure form of the elements. And then this very profound clarity, very profound non-duality, this kind of
Mm.
clear light experience, and then also the arisal of the Shitra deities. So
Yeah.
it's funny. Somebody had just messaged me, a friend of mine who's studying at the University of Hamburg last night, and she was saying that she had heard somebody call dark retreat a kind of like a homeopathic dose of death. You kind of the practice itself kind of like leads to this kind of near death like experience, which is actually one of the things that it does. It's said to kind of exhaust our relationship to appearance as something that we experience in a discursive confused way.
Yeah.
This and the dissolutions of these elements are the thing that helps aid in the achievement of rainbow body.
So this is very interesting. So it's a little bit layered here. So you practice Tumo, you'll
Hmm.
get familiar with the practice of dissolving the subtle energies
Hmm.
in the central channel, and then you go into dark retreat, right? And you're doing the dissolution. You have the signs again,
Hmm.
and the signs are very vivid in this case.
Hmm. Hmm.
And then, but then also it goes further because then you start to move into like the Bado Turdral sort of practices, to Tibetan Book of Liberation and Hearing, the Tibetan
Yeah.
Book of
So
Living and Dying. So you're having the visions of the deities as you would have going through the death process, the Bado process. Is that what's happening?
so so I started off with the Yutuk Nintik Dark Retreat, which occurs. It's a 7-day practice,
Yeah.
7-day retreat, and so this was kind of the preparation that was presented to me as you do this to prepare. And then I had about 2 weeks after that, and then I went into the 49-day dark retreat using the Yangti Nakpo based instructions. And the nature of the practice itself is very, very different. How you practice, and then the best way to say it is that it's there's kind of like this yogic curation that occurs where phase by phase there's 7 steps, and with each instruction, each kind of practice, a very kind of palpable experience occurs. Some cases, intense non-duality. In some cases, bliss. In some cases, the Bardo deities. In some cases,
Yeah.
profound, like clear light or Rigpa experience. And so after the 7-day Yujognintik-based preparatory retreat. Then I entered into a 49-day Yangti Nakpo-based retreat, and that's what that's so interesting. In that 49-day retreat, I saw this Tigle, and who was in it?
Yeah.
Pathing Rinpoche.
Pathing
And
Rinpoche in the Tigle. How
in the
cool.
Tigle, and I was just, I mean, I started crying. I just felt this intense, love and closeness. And he passed away in 2007. And I began to kind of realize, this relationship is a lot more significant than
Yeah.
the standard way one might tend to judge these
So
things.
he did come to do Dark Retreat with you, actually.
Exactly. And he I did one earlier this year,
Yeah.
and he kept coming. you
Yeah.
know it led me to kind of begin to understand that it's very hard for us to kind of understand who we are in terms of our Dharma practice, and what the lineage connections are that are alive for us while we're alive, because we're always in process, right?
Yeah.
Like, I credit the Karma Kagyu. I mean, I love the Karma Kagyu tradition for some very, very rigorous training. And there's a very strong thread I'm beginning to kind of recognize of my own spiritual life that is more Yangti Nakpo based.
Wow. So and so we'll get into the meaning and why of the
Mm-hmm.
visions as well. But
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to, so the 49 days, the 7 days and 49 days are obviously very crucial to the Bardo Todro teachings
Mm-hmm.
as well. So it seems like it's very like the seven times seven, 49 days. And so this dark retreat text seems really mapped onto the Bardo Todro 49-day teachings, and that's what you did, right? Which is a little bit familiar. I have friends who have done the 49-day Bonpo Dark Retreat sort of
Okay.
thing. So they do the 49 days as well. So that's very interesting. But I want to move to the Yangti Nakpo, which seems to be a different sort of which is this text. So the text you had from Pathing Rinpoche was not this Yunting text, what we've just been talking about.
Exactly.
And so
Exactly.
maybe you could tell a little bit about how what was that practice and how did it differ from what you were doing in the Yutok Nintik dark retreat?
Yeah. So that text, excuse me, is more of a classical Dzogchen presentation, like I mentioned, with the three main asanas, the
Yes.
elephant asana, etc., rishi and lion, and also laying down. And with this, it's more curated in terms of visions, and there's not a lot of text around instructions, so that part
Mm.
is oral. Um, so after the 49-day dark retreat, I met with Dr. Nida. This is still during COVID kind of lockdown times, so we met virtually. And he examined my experiences, and pretty thoroughly. And he asked me, like, what do you think of this practice? And I said, this is it. Like, I can't. This is my main practice. Like, I feel.
Wow.
And so,
Can I ask you
mhm,
just a question here? Because when you say he examined your experience, I think people get very curious. Like, what does that look like? Because you have a very
yeah,
special situation here, and a lot of people don't have access to that kind of training. And so,
yeah, yeah,
maybe you could share a little bit of what that looks like when you're sharing your
yeah,
experiencing and he's examining them.
yeah. So, for example, what did you see? You know,
Mm.
um, so there are certain kind of, I guess you could say, markers. And this is the very fascinating thing about this. I actually have a real strong desire to kind of curate dark retreat for faith leaders of other faith traditions, to kind of
Mm.
really see how much of a yeah, universal architecture there may be,
Mm.
inherent in this, because uh, you see all of the classical things, like the different ways of experience, the five colored lights, which represent the five Buddha families, and the five elements, and then uh, different kinds of mandala presentations of deities, different kinds of visionary phenomena. sometimes yidams can come, protectors can
So,
come.
so the visions feel very Buddhisty to you, and you're curious about other traditions and what it might look
Yeah,
like to them. That's what you're
if a
saying.
rabbi or if a Catholic priest or
Got it.
like Father Tiso, for example, would
Yeah,
be an
yeah, yeah.
interesting
Yeah,
person.
rainbow body guy.
Yeah, yeah. So he really thoroughly examined different things and explained what each one meant.
So I say, so say you say, oh, and I saw this Tigle and I saw this
Hmm.
Buddha, and so then what does he say when you say something?
So this is the pure manifestation of the element earth, or this
Okay.
is this
Yeah.
is the element fire, this is
Got it.
space. There is some very so dark retreat, like I've heard him describe it this way, and I would say it's I would describe it the same way. Highly, highly experiential, right? So you're just
Mm.
constantly it's some days in the dark, the visions are just constantly happening. It can be a little exhausting, it can also be a little overwhelming, which is why thorough Dharma practice is really helpful,
Yeah.
meditation practice in particular, not just knowledge. um, and so the appearance of particular, if a protector comes, or if you see Guru Rinpoche, or
Yeah.
and what they might say, or things like this. Also dreams. What was very common is that the dream experience would happen, and you could have a greater lucidity in that experience, but then you also wake up and you are awake, and the dream imagery is still happening,
Yeah.
which offers a very good kind of contemplative um, monkey wrench, in this kind of assumption of day and night, and who am I, and what is real and what is not real, things of that nature. It's interesting that we started off the conversation about shamanism, because in every single dark retreat practice I've done, or retreat, the experience while doing it feels more shamanistic than it does, again, classical, like, Indian based Buddhist, you know.
Yep.
And I suspect there is probably some, I don't know how we would even know this. There are some theories that, some of the basis of these practices came not from India, but from perhaps China or from Central Asia, things like this.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And it's a different, you mentioned something about these things happening to you in a way, and of course
Hmm.
you examine in that as well, but it certainly is different to the way you normally would meditate when you're visualizing something, you're doing something, or when
Exactly.
often when things happen to you, that's like considered a distraction or an obstacle, or even
Right.
when you're not trying to do anything and things are happening, but this is like very much like it's your one of your most powerful senses, vision, right? And to
Yes.
have that happening to you in a very visual way and constantly would be quite the different type of meditative experience, if you will. And it does remind one of shamanistic or um yeah, shamanistic ayahuasca type like visions, right? So we'll probably tackle that a little bit later, the similarities and differences and
Hmm.
why and
Hmm.
purpose and all this sort of stuff. But yeah, thank you for sharing that intimate sort of conversation with your teacher from your retreat.
Hmm.
I think that's very precious, and thank you for opening up about that. It's really nice to see those types of interactions. And so but he ends up taking you onto this different type. So you sort of go through that interaction you have, and it's like a
Hmm.
learning experience as well. And
Hmm.
that seems to be preparation for the next type of dark retreat. Is that right?
Right. Yeah, for the 49-day retreat, which is what I did after this, which is based on the instructions from his. So the Utug Nintic instructions are, come from the Utug Nintic, and then these more Yangti Nakpo based instructions came from his dark retreat teacher in Tibet, who he had mentioned at this talk at the Reuben. His teacher, when he was 16, had been locked in a dark retreat room by his teacher's teacher, for something like 6 months when he was 16. Um, and like this is how he, and perhaps his teacher saw that, but so his dark retreat teacher was, that was his primary focus.
Is the Kachok Kolo Rinpoche you mentioned before, or different?
Yeah,
Kachik,
yeah,
I
yeah.
guess. Kachik Kolo Rinpoche, is it?
Karjit Korlo
Oh, Kachik
Rinpoche.
Kolo
Yeah,
Rinpoche. Okay.
yeah. And so he also, Dr. Nida told me that he used to say, his dark retreat teacher, that when you do Yangti practice, Longchenpa just becomes words, right? Because you understand for yourself in this moment, right? And that which and it, like, I'm not definitely not saying I'm Longchenpa, but you have experiences, right? That are the experiences that are being pointed out. And the very important thing to appreciate about this is that these experiences really cannot be contained very well by language. So it's very
Yes.
important to have these, because then it's kind of like somebody turns on the real lights and you see everything, right? You're able to actually understand, in a very kind of visceral way, the kind of relationship and at times differences between Sem and Rigpa, conceptual mind, and vast, spacious, immortally pure awareness that is the true nature, not only of our mind, but of all phenomena. And so, this is what distinguishes. It's a very kind of intensive practice, in the sense that it's a little exhausting. Like, you come out clear and, maybe a little bit, similar to different kinds of, plant medicine kind of experiences, very, very kind of like receptive, so to speak, but a little bit tired because you've been kind of, um, maybe you could just say processing, so much, experiencing so much, and even while maintaining the kind of Checha view, right,
Yeah.
of simplicity, non-effort, all of these kinds of things. It's still a very vivid, um, essentially pointing out an experience. And this is like the thing that's important to recognize is, like, the Yangti practice for some people is a main practice. For many people, it's a little bit, it's an enhancement practice, right? It's the thing
Yes.
that causes you to kind of understand very viscerally the nature of appearance itself. The nature of death, though, too. There's a so what's interesting is I had, um, prior to all of this, been, worked professionally as a full-time hospice chaplain and, chaplain in New York City Department of Correction. Even while I was doing the Yangti practices, I was still at on Rikers Island, as is the basis of a lot of my work, and that was very, very good training for kind of beginning to kind of understand the appearance of violence and the experience of the appearance of harm, and even things like systemic racism, all this kind of stuff, and being in all of that, to be a compassionate presence while not being distracted by the nature of the appearance itself. Like, I quite enjoyed being, on Rikers Island for that reason, right? It was kind of like a, obviously, like a, professional, um, chaplaincy, right livelihood kind of situation, but it was also a
Yeah.
place of constant practice.
Yeah, I bet. What was so what was the difference between the two styles of dark retreat? So what is the difference between this? So the one that was a
Yeah.
tummo sort of dissolution, going into the
Hmm.
visions of the bardo, that sort of thing, and then which was more the you was that the Yutok Nintik one, and then the
Using,
one,
yeah.
but then the one you had the thing that started it all with Pathing Rinpoche,
Hmm.
that type of dark retreat, um uh this type of dark retreat. What is different about the two?
So the difference is a little subtle in the sense that it's tonal, right? The Utagnintic based dark retreat is, one seeks to cultivate a lived presence of ease, relaxation, yeah, and maybe you could say receptivity, right? Just
Yeah.
letting whatever is happening. And there's basically one kind of practice to do, which is very, very subtle and gentle. And then the Yangti Ngakpa practice, it's not like not subtle. It is still subtle, but there is a kind of emphasis on a way of, you know, relating to what is happening in a little bit more of a focused, a little bit more of a curated way. Right. So for the 49-day retreat, there's seven, each instruction you do for 7 days. And
Yeah.
they are different enough so that when you start with the first one and then move into the second, they're related, but the experience that comes is quite how to say, like, different than the one that came before. So
Yes.
it's not progressive necessarily, like one step and another step and another step, but the tone differs a little bit. As a little bit like the death process itself, right? So
Like
like in the,
luminosity of Dharma Chat, second luminosity,
exactly.
going into visions and stuff like that. So
Hmm.
in
Hmm.
a way, it's like my teacher often describes this as like being on a bus, first bus stop, second bus stop, third bus
Exactly,
stop. Like, do
exactly,
you get off
exactly,
or do you keep going? Right?
exactly.
That sort of thing.
And
Yeah.
there's a lot of very interesting, phenomena that occurs, like um, visionary experiences of beings in the bardo.
Yeah.
This was something that I experienced, not so much in the last two, but many of them, um, as if to say this bus is going right through the bardo, and you can
Yeah.
see, this person, that person, those people, even in the attire of a particular time period, like the
Yeah.
1980s,
Yeah.
like early 1980s, or I had this visionary experience of some soldiers from like World War II era, that kind of like military outfit, you know,
Wow.
because the thing is like the thing that I think I've learned the most about how Yangti practice relates to the Bardo is like we say 49 days, right? But is how long the Bardo takes. But the process itself is not like a factory where at the end of the 49 days everything is over, right? And then the person just moves into the next uh, birth, or realizes the nature of mind, or what have you. So it's possible for some that, and time isn't the same too, right? Like
No way.
when you've
Yeah.
died, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
like, so the what I learned pretty quickly is like, oh, you should really think differently about this, and it caused me to relate very differently to, especially in my work as a chaplain, to kind of understand the ways that people die, and then what may or may not be occurring for them. There's actually a significant benefit
Mm.
that led me to. I used to offer retreats at KTD with one of the KTD lamas there on death and dying, and
Mm.
had done a lot of kind of leading retreats or teaching these practices. And there's a big part of me that is kind of aghast that I trained in Bardo yoga, all this kind of Poa, all that. But then the post Yangti experience and approach and my knowledge base way different. In fact, I don't even. I was telling someone a couple of weeks ago that I don't even understand the benefit of going to somebody for these practices if they haven't done Yangti practice, because you begin to kind of understand uh, the different nature of time, the different nature of what death is, and a kind of greater awareness of actually where somebody might be in that process themselves.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about this. So I was trying to differentiate between the two types of practices, but it seems like we don't really need to do that. It seems like it's very obvious the one the first type is linked to this sort of like Balo Turdrol type practice. Second one,
Hmm.
maybe more straight Dzogchen.
Hmm.
Seems like that. But one of the questions I was interested in is you have all these types of practices like and traditions. So you might that involve visions, right?
Hmm.
So you might have the ayahuasca, you might have some sort of shamanic drumming that gives you visions. You might have, or even dream yoga that works with appearances. So you have all these different types of, um, different sort, even like, the standard space-like meditation, post meditation, illusory practices, these sort of things, right? And so,
Hmm.
um, so I was wondering, how does this dark retreat and its vision sit alongside these practices? So how are this type of yoga similar to these other types of yogic practices, and how might it be doing something different than those?
Hmm. Yeah, good question. So I think, I've had some time to think about this. Um, Context matters, right?
Mm,
So the context of dark retreat is Dzogchen,
mm,
right? And Dzogchen has a particular kind of point of orientation with respect to not only the nature of our mind, but the nature of all appearance itself. So in other and again, I'm not the most experienced with plant medicines and things like this, but in a lot of from what I understand from a lot of shamanic traditions, there is a kind of understanding that the medicine itself or the plant is a spirit that is kind of like a guide that is aiding the practitioner to have a particular kind of realization. Whereas dark retreat in a Dzogchen based way is much more hands off in the sense that everything dissolves and then you have this direct experience of what the nature of the universe actually is, right? And so what I'm not saying is that they don't necessarily dance around a similar kind. I mean, let's face it, like my work as a chaplain and then studying comparative religion, like I don't want to say any one faith tradition has a more of a kind of approach to an understanding of ultimate reality than any other. um, so maybe we could say a lot of these practices are kind of dancing around the same human kind of the human drive to understand and open up to their own primordial purity. I do think that shamanic practices sometimes, though, don't like shoot right into that, whereas dark retreat really shoots into this, which is why there's a little bit of a risk factor in doing the practice. I mean, even when I teach Czechja,
yeah.
it's common for people to have kind of a fear response to letting go into this experience of vast openness without any reference point, and that's with eyes open and awareness
Yeah, yeah,
of you know
yeah.
their surroundings, right? As opposed to being in this experience of the other thing is like with dark retreat, you're not under the influence of anything.
Yeah.
So if you leave the room or the space, you will kind of be with all of your senses in the normal
Yeah.
way as well. Um, so even and I'm a lot less knowledgeable about this, but from what I understand about dark retreat in the Kala Chakra tradition,
Yeah.
there's a practice of it there too, and this connects a little bit more with illusory, kind of the pure illusory body practice, where you're seeking to recognize that you are the manifestation of the illusory body of the deity. With there's a slight tonal difference as well with the Dzogchen, kind of context to
Yeah.
this.
This Tongsu type thing. Yeah. So stepping through these things might be helpful like peel away the layers and get some sort of distinctions going. Let's see how we go. So of course we could start with the more, maybe we can say grosser sort of vision that rely upon substances like plant medicine and
Hmm.
stuff like that.
Hmm.
And so one thing you're saying is that and we might contrast that with like a Buddhist practice where you develop the insight into emptiness to understand the illusory nature of appearances, right?
Hmm.
And so
Hmm.
from the very beginning, we can start to tease out that this may be different. You might be going to plant medicine to discover something like about yourself or be taught in some way. The goal may not be to see the nature of reality and see how that relates to appearances, right? Maybe it
Hmm.
is, but not
Hmm.
necessarily, right? So then we can, let's just leave that one to the side, even though
Hmm.
it seems so similar because of the visions, right?
Hmm.
But maybe it's
Exactly.
doing something, maybe it looks the same, but it's doing something totally different. Maybe not.
Hmm.
We can talk to people who are advanced in that tradition maybe one day. And then you've got
Sure.
this normal standard sutra sort of practice where you're like understanding, you have experience of emptiness, and then that in post meditation you have an experience of the way appearances relate in that way, emptiness and appearances, right? And then you might have you might go deeper into dream yoga, right?
Hmm.
And
Yes.
so in dream yoga, what you might start to learn that not only are the appearances illusory in nature because of emptiness, but they have this intimate connection with your own mind, right?
Yes. Yes.
Right. So that's
Yeah.
like another. Then dream yoga is a little bit more. It's not just appearances are illusory. It's that these in dream yoga you start to say, wow, this whole world and experience and this like is really deeply connected with my own mind. And so,
Hmm.
what's the nature of my own mind, for example, right?
Yes. Yes.
And then and then so we go. So then we've got dream yoga and we've got that sort of thing, and then we go into dark retreat. And it seems like maybe dark retreat is like you're really getting to like we can understand that the mind's empty. We can understand that the mind is maybe has these certain qualities, but then we understand that there's an energy associated with that mind that is really arising as these type of appearances. And it seems like so yeah, maybe you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, so what I would say is we could even say the difference between dream yoga and clear light yoga, right? Because these two are different enough from one another as well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
So,
yep.
so you know, in and this is not to say that there's any kind of lesser practice. You know, dream yoga is a lesser practice, but with the practice of clear light, one is training in resting into unfabricated awareness in the dream state itself. So it's not to say that dream phenomena don't arise, but the emphasis is on the lucidity and the clarity aspect of mind there, which is closer to what the dark retreat experience is as well. So in the midst of all of the vividness, right, the visions are not the point, right? In terms of kind of like a psychoanalytic archaeology
Yeah.
of like trying to understand what all this stuff means, right? And what's great is the view, even as we find presented in Tilopa's Six Nails, is the same kind of view, right? Don't examine, right? Don't try to figure out any of what's happening. Rest into the lucidity, the clarity, the Rigpa essence of all of this, right?
Yep.
So this is like the more, I guess you could say, kind of bare bones kind of aspect of it, right? Like everybody tends to, I mean, almost all the time, people are like, oh, the visions, the visions, the visions, a lot like people, who work with psychedelics. But, the visions are the patterning of our own mind, you know, in many cases. And then in other cases, the direct experience of the clarity of the nature of our own mind. And we're trying to recognize the knowingness of this and not, adhere to the actual appearance itself.
This is brilliant. This is where exactly where I wanted to get. So, so nicely said. And so, what if someone said this to you? They said, like, okay, so I'm not even a Buddhist, but I do lucid dreaming, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when I dream, I'm very aware that I'm dreaming, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they might say that they have an experiential understanding of the dreamlike nature of their dreams, right?
Hmm.
How would you say that what are they missing? I guess is my question here. Right? What are they missing in terms of what is you've sort of already answered this question, but I was going to ask this question anyway, so I may as well ask it and
Hmm.
get the answer again. So how would you answer a question like that?
Yeah, so the recognition of the nature of awareness itself, right? So this is the kind of key thing with kind of the direct experience of Rigpa is it's not outward. This, I mean, it is. It's multi-directional, right? So what in kind of the kind beginning stages, as it were, our awareness appears to be moving outward towards things, right? And within the context of dream experience, same thing, right? There's an objective experience that we are aware of, but then for awareness to be aware of its own nature itself, right, leads to this experience of a letting go of any kind of differentiation between, this thing and that thing. There's a kind of like settled, open, so all of these classical words, terms, right? Clear, vast,
Yeah.
luminous, right? They all dance around this experience of of awareness. Even this instruction, many years ago, I heard Choki Rinpoche use this in Bodh Gaya. He's like, it's like an eyeball trying to look at itself,
Yeah.
right? And so when we have that experience, like that is the Rigpa essence. So that is the same clear light essence, and this is the differentiation between uh, the clear light state as experienced in a sleeping context of clear light yoga, or in the bardo experience, after
Yeah.
everything dissolves, then there's this opportunity for a profound insight, and if that is recognized, then the whole kind of nature of what comes next is seen for what it is, and the yogini or yogi, even in the bardo, then has agency to appreciate the play of all of this, and then they're able to manifest in whatever form
Yeah,
comes
so it's
next.
very interesting. So that what's so important is really what, in the practice of trekture, or, this is sort of what you're describing, right? And
Yeah.
so then that seems to be, but then you do this dark retreat is like almost like enhancement, right? So what's the role of visions then? So say you were doing trekture, right?
Hmm.
And you're like, okay, I've got a sense of this nature of this mind and the vastness and all these things we just said. And
Hmm.
then what's the role of going into dark retreat and the relationship of visions and that space? So
Yeah.
like, yeah,
Yeah. So in that the visionary aspect of this is, and this is a little bit like you find in the Bardo Total. It's really just the natural arising manifestation of appearance coming from our own essence,
yeah,
right? So the difference between like and again, I want to be super clear about not denigrating uh, dream yoga, but you often find people who are into dream yoga just to kind of play around in their dreams, right? I read this. It was like a little snippet of uh, something from Choshik Donak Lingpa, who was Ani Shuksab's Yangti teacher, who was saying that even in the dream state, people can amass. I mean, basically, our karma is playing out even in how we're reacting into dreams, like so the fear response,
yeah,
or lust, or different kinds of things. And so, what we're really trying to do is understand that everything, all of this, arises from ourselves. All of our little Zoom screens, like all appearances arising from our basic purity, and what it is that we are stuck in is constant reactivity. So it's kind of like what, as practitioners or for non-practitioners as well, it's kind of like we're always chasing our tail, like our reactions, our assumptions, all this kind of stuff in relationship to appearance. The primary recognition here is that all of this that it's coming from, and you find this uh, described in throughout the context, the Dzogchen context, where everything that arises is empty, its nature is clarity, and it is compassionate. We could say compassionate manifestation. Right? Everything that's arising is you and me and everything else is of the same enlightened nature. And yet we do all of the things we do in this world, trying to control or react or subjugate or chase after, appearance for what we think it is or assume it to be.
Yeah, and it seems like seems to be one of the main points here is those three qualities you mentioned are characteristics of the base, this sort of what you were talking about when you're doing trekture, this sort of expanse, this sort of thing you're in touch with. And so it seems like these practices really not only get us in touch with this, but allow us to also understand that there's a dynamic aspect to this space, right? And that
Exactly.
and that and that there's an energy, that this is not just some inert emptiness. There's an activity and
Yes.
energy. And so you could see, of course, that's true, just like us now, right? But maybe these practices give you a special insight into that activity aspect of what you might think is, you might, just being very clear that this is not an infinite space like emptiness. This is a very active, energetic um, um, quality to the nature of your mind. And
Yes.
seeing that directly is probably very profound. I don't know. You can talk. If you could talk to that,
Yeah.
it'd be great.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah. So to your point, what we experience is what we might call the compassionate responsiveness of the emptiness of Rigpa itself, right? It's responsive almost, again, the words are always going to fail. Like we're playing in water, right? Like the fluidity of water. When we cup water together in our hands, it conforms to all of the nooks and crannies between our fingers and things like this. This is the Rigpa essence is naturally responsive and compassionate. It is this, I think, is the hardest thing for people to even conceptually get their minds around, because we're so trained both in terms of our confusion, but then even our kind of highly materialist and scientific way of thinking of things is
Mm.
uh, all of these things are outside of me, and I therefore need some kind of protection, right? It's not necessarily, all of this is not necessarily trustworthy, right?
Yeah.
And really, like, imagine, right, what mindset you have to dissolve into a rainbow, right? So, like, it has to be open, is this kind of recognition that there is no differentiation between myself and any other thing.
That's a cool thought. What sort of space do you have to be in to dissolve into a rainbow? That's a pretty cool that's a cool thing to think about. How do you think about, maybe we can finish up on this. How do you think about appearances now? So, you know, having spent so much time in the dark, how long have you spent doing these retreats?
Probably at this point, a little over 100 days.
Insane. Like
Yeah.
totally. That's like, and so you've had a lot of time in the dark with these appearances. How do you, how do you relate? How's this changed the way you relate to everyday appearances, dreams, these appearances in the dark? How do you relate to these different types of appearance?
Yeah, so in one sense, there's a greater experience of more of like a natural clear light yoga style sleeping experience. Um, meaning that as I am asleep, there is a kind of pronounced awareness of not just, you know, even my own physicality or the nature of what is happening in the room, but also of awareness itself. Not all the time, definitely, but there's more of that than there was before. My practice of Chukcha is, I mean, it has changed infinitely in the sense of like what the settling into non-effort, very relaxed. I tend to try to use the word harmonious ease because even in dark retreat, when you're in dark retreat and you settle into trekcha, you can actually feel the nature of the relationship to the rigpa state shift, right? The more still, the more relaxed and easeful your mind is. This increased understanding, like experiential understanding, that all of this is a play of light and energy and sound and you know every sensation. This is actually the great thing about the Yutuk Mintik Ati Yoga instructions is that there's a really nice emphasis on the experience of Rigpa through sense gates, right? Because awareness is not just the, you know,
Yep.
our problem inadvertently maybe of you know Dharma kind of coming into our culture through the academic world, which is already so mind oriented. We think of, you know, this being, you know, philosophical, definitely cognitive, even in some ways. People are always trying to like understand the brain in relationship to this, but it is actually even more than that, right? So there's an increased sense of uh, an experience of this, and then death. Like I don't really fear. I think the larger concern I have is, you know, for example, my kids. You know, they're you know the emotional turmoil. Should I die? You know, next week or something like this. But having any kind of fear around that, I don't have anymore.
Mm.
You know, or
That's
even interest in ritual around death. You know, there's I think this is the other part of like it's my practice has just become very essentialized. It's basically, you know, mostly Hatha yoga, so Chukcha and dark retreat, some Togo with light instruction, and then protector practice, Guru yoga.
yeah.
You know, um, anything else feels like too much. You know, maybe it's like going to Japan and appreciating,
It's
you know
awesome.
the
Yeah.
simplicity of you know the art forms and
It sounds very attractive, and it's interesting that protector practices in there. That and it came up before in your dark retreat when you're saying that. So protector practices, which seem very esoteric, like a lot of the Trekchö Togyo seems very like practical.
Mhm.
Guru yoga is of course feels a little bit more visual, but of course that's related to
Yeah.
Trekchö. But protector practice, that how does that fit into this other trio?
So it fits in the sense that the container is important, right? Many years ago, prior to becoming kind of very connected with Buddhism, I used to study alchemy in the Western
Oh
mystical
wow.
tradition.
Yeah.
And the thing where I go with protectors is protector practice keeps the crucible where you know the alchemical operation is happening clean and protected and secure. Not that I'm worried about like you know black magicians coming, but more the intention around that. You also begin to see with dark retreat that the you know Dzogchen has a lot to do with energy, right? The energy of a particular kind of situation, the
Mm.
energy of what's happening in this moment, the energy that's arising, you know, within my own body, the energy that I'm experiencing externally, uh, and protector practice is really like essentially about deep listening and um, this is gonna sound weird, but it makes sense within the context of like New York City Department of Correction that force is sometimes your friend, right?
Mm.
Like clearing holding a difficult experience is sometimes best done with a relationship to the protectors. Uh, not a kind of superstitious thing, but really understanding that a great deal of energy sometimes needs to be in place to hold this whole process. So
Mm,
the only ritual that I do before, pre, and post is protector practice. Between
mm.
these retreats. Um, when preparing for them. Um, yeah, I don't.
That makes sense, and it's interesting. So there's a lot of people listening who might think, I would love to do dark retreat, but that just seems like, the top league, right?
Yes.
And I don't know if I'll ever do that in this life. But I do retreat. Maybe
Hmm.
I do a weekend retreat, or I do a 10-day retreat, or I hope to do longer retreat, maybe not dark retreats. I'm wondering what you've learned about just retreats in general and preparing for retreats, and something that, like, things you've learned through dark retreat that might
Hmm.
apply to any type of retreat, from weekends to 7 days and beyond, but not necessarily dark retreats.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, for me, solitary retreat is a good kind of initial approach, right? Um, Group retreats are fine, but I even find leading them that you can almost watch the contagion of one person's statement or energy impacting another person, and like what is playing out sometimes is just kind of like spiritual interpersonal dynamics. um so solitary retreat is a good place to go. Like if you've never done that, then do like a weekend or a long weekend. Get an Airbnb, or if you can just control the situation in your apartment or at home, um so that you can really be alone, do that. And then do that, uh, and focus just on practices, open awareness practices. Like Mahamudra is a very good, parallel practice to Trekcha itself. Um, the practice of clear light, illusory body, is such an amazing practice as well. So if somebody, it's maybe you could say it's a little bit easier to connect to all the causes and conditions to be able to receive instruction and all this for these kinds of practices, then those are quite good. Tumo too, to really kind of understand this relationship between energy in the body and then the profundity of the non-duality that comes. People often kind of get a little hung up about the experience of heat, and that can be an important part of the practice, but it's the kind of bliss that kind of short circuits conceptual mind, right? Or makes it kind of almost like die on the vine, and then what is left, awareness, right? So um guru yoga practice, um there's a lot. I mean, I think the other part is then embracing this ethos of trying to be as relaxed as possible. If you do retreat, try to do something that physically tires you out a little bit, so that then as you settle, you're really settling, right? You're not settling as somebody who is striving to have a particular kind of experience. You're really kind of just relaxed, maybe distracted out of ambition, distracted out of a kind of searching or grasping for a particular kind of experience.
So, for example, what might someone do?
So, if you can, I mean, I live in rural Massachusetts. I can, the retreat center here is on 60 acres, so you can run around, chop wood.
Yeah.
You can
So
do
doing something
prostrations.
physical, something physical. Yeah.
Physical is very helpful. It also kind of gets you out of the kind of, I mean, primarily the striving, the over focus on body and external things. Prostrations is a really really good
Yeah.
practice in this way. But physical labor, it makes me think of Milarepa and Marpa, right?
Yeah.
Like, all of that work that Marpa made Milarepa do was not just some kind of arbitrary thing on his part. I think he was really helping Milarepa to kind of get out of what I would kind of tend to assume was this intense kind of lungy anxiety around all of the murder, all of the consequences, and then this deep desire to get free. Because
Yes.
the desire to get free is not inherently bad, but when it's attachment based, it's a problem. You
Yes.
know?
There's great wisdom in these stories that are not necessarily explicit, right?
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, the other part of Milarepa's story that I tend to try to kind of introduce people to is imagine he's all alone. His lama's far away. He's feeling guilt or shame and he must have cried a lot. And you never really, might read a little bit about him crying, but imagine, as you're really kind of understanding the nature of your mind, and then you kind of reflect on, oh my gosh, all the stuff I did,
Mm.
how tortured I was to do that, right? How confused I was. And now I'm not. And I'm grateful for this, precious human birth and where I am in this moment, but all these other beings, even, somebody like Milarepa out in the wilderness, watching animals play out,
Yeah.
their conditioning, carnivores, catch. I was I was doing some work here on the property last week, and I heard a hawk, and then it flew through, through the woods, and it had a squirrel in its
Wow.
talons, and it looked, very happy, and the squirrel did not. But like conditioning like that,
Yeah.
you know, very, very, very kind of I don't want to use the word innate, because what is innate is our Rigpa essence,
Mm.
but highly, almost like biologically, or in the case of us humans, genetically in some cases, or through our ancestry, conditioned to just kind of like be reacting and reacting and reacting and reacting.
Lama Justin, thank you so much for spending time with us today on the Wisdom Podcast. How can people get in contact with you? And then how can people who, take their first step into learning more about Dark Retreat?
Yeah, so thank you, Daniel. It's a pleasure to be here. The Wisdom Podcast is great. So you can reach out to the organization I run here in Western Massachusetts at yangtiyoga.com. You can reach out to me through there, see all of the programming that we're doing. And then I'm happy to say that I'm also working on a book with you and with Wisdom on all of this as well. So this is something to look forward to in the future.
Very exciting. Thank you so much. Been a
Thank
pleasure.
you. Thank you.